Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our November 6th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode features one big-picture conversation about global food demand and a separate tactical conversation about a very specific opportunity for Iowa farmers to save money on their taxes. Let's start with the subject of tax savings with Dustin Petty of Base. Base is an Iowa-based company that's saved Farm Bureau members thousands of dollars over the years through the company's various IRS-approved tax savings plans. For more on those plans, we'll turn it over to spokesman reporter Bob Bion and Dustin Petty.
Good morning, Dustin. Thanks for being with us today. Base has been a partner of choice for Iowa Farm Bureau for a little more than 10 years. Yet many members may not be familiar with Base and the value offered to Iowa Farm Bureau members.
Yes. Well, thanks for having us. It's great to be here. It has been a great relationship with Iowa Farm Bureau, and we've gained a lot of success here, helping out farmers with healthcare costs. And we're a third-party administrator for HRA plans, HSAs, cafeteria plans, as far as administering tax-beneficial ways to save some tax dollars in reference to the healthcare costs. We've been around since 1999 here in Adel, Iowa. We service all states, but really pride ourselves on our Midwestern values and the service that we provide to our clients with the communication skills to be over the phone, in person. We work with a lot of different clients in several different ways. And I've actually been with Base, celebrated my 20th year here. So been around quite some time, and we have a very tenured company. We have a lot of people that have been here with 10, 15, 20 years of experience. So we really pride ourselves on that as being a company that has very valued, tenured employees here. I personally work with agents, accounting and tax professionals, CPAs, EAs, as far as helping ways for clients to save tax dollars in reference to their healthcare expenses. And so I really found a lot of joy doing that for the last 20 years.
Farmers are often small employers for their farm or business. What tax advantages are available if they have a small employer group health plan?
For that small employer group health plan, there's a couple things that we need to be looking at. There's what's referred to as an ERISA-wrap document that's required by the Department of Labor for anyone that offers a group or company-sponsored plan. So we would work with them as far as establishing that, but then they also may be looking at other additional ways to save some tax dollars on out-of-pocket costs, that being with an integrated HRA or a health reimbursement arrangement plan or health savings accounts here in regards to that. One of the things that we really look at in that small group plan is to try to see what are ways that we can help the client save some tax dollars, not only for their premium, but also for those out-of-pocket medical expenses.
What if a farmer or small business employer does not want to offer a health insurance plan, but would like to offer monies to their employees to help cover the cost of health insurance?
So that's a great question, and that's what we see more and more of today, is where farms are expanding, where maybe the son is maybe coming over to take over the farm and they're gaining a couple more hired help. With that, they're looking at different things with what's referred to as an ICRA, or an individual coverage health reimbursement arrangement plan, or a QSARA, a qualified small employer health reimbursement arrangement. Both of those plans allow the employer to reimburse employees tax-free for individual health insurance premiums. So that really benefits the employer because they don't have to get that group or company-sponsored health plan. This is a way for them to potentially reimburse an employee tax-free for them to go out and purchase their own individual health insurance plan.
Can you give us specific examples of how farmers can save on these tax-advantaged plans? Is there an average savings?
With this, through that Section 105 plan, which is for that husband and wife operation or that single member corporation, Again, that was created, this Section 105 plan, back in 1954, and has been one of the longest standing tax beneficial plans out there today. So with the cost of healthcare, with the increased cost of premiums, and also with a big increase in the cost of out-of-pocket expenses, our clients saved last year over $6,000 for those as far as a tax deduction.
So what should listeners do to find more information on these programs you've shared?
A great thing is obviously to visit us online at www.baseonline.com, or they can reach out to us at the Farm Bureau number 866-550-5525.
Anything else our listeners should know?
One of the things that we would just suggest for your clients is to speak with their accountant or tax professional. We work with a lot of those people. Speak with their health insurance agent. This is something that BASE really can provide great value for them in reference to that tax savings program. The cost of healthcare continues to increase, not only for the premiums, but as well as for those out-of-pocket expenses. So if we're able to help that farmer save some tax dollars, that's going to be extremely beneficial for them moving forward.
Thanks, Dustin. Everyone knows that taxes are complicated, so this definitely isn't the easiest topic to fully grasp in just one podcast episode. But it is clear that there are some significant savings at stake here. BASE saves its clients an average of $6,200 in taxes annually, and Iowa Farm Bureau members receive an exclusive discount on BASE's services. To learn more and to set up a call with the folks at BASE, check out the link we've included in the notes for this episode. Okay, ready to shift topics? Let's talk about global food demand, advancements in ag production, the need for new ag research, and more with Dr. Cary Fowler, who's the Special Envoy for Global Food Security with the U.S. Department of State. Dr. Fowler was in Des Moines for the annual World Food Prize gathering late last month, which is where he met up with Spokesman editor Tom Block.
Well, Dr. Fowler, thanks for joining me. You're here in Des Moines for the World Food Prize. How would you describe the importance and relevance of the Borlaug Dialogue and the World Food Prize in bringing people from the U.S. together with people from across the globe for conversations about agriculture and food security, things like that?
Well, you really said it. This is a unique event, and one might think, given the importance of food security in the world, that there would be many similar events where you draw together farmers and plant breeders and nutritionists and agricultural economists and the whole range of folks to talk about a common concern, food security. This is really the premier event in the world, and it draws people from, I think they said 70 countries this year, all the different kinds of disciplines, but all focused on a particular problem and a particular goal, which is try to promote food security.
And it's been a long-standing event, and it seems to get bigger and more popular every year. Have you been here before? What are your impressions of this year?
I have been here before. I was here last year. I was here the year that George McGovern and Bob Dole jointly won the food prize. It has gotten better over the years and bigger. And the one thing that I think is really important and I find extremely attractive is the number of young professionals, young people, because we need to bring young people into agriculture in all different ways, in all different angles. And this gives young people the chance to talk to seasoned, grizzled veterans like myself and hopefully get a little bit inspired or maybe see that there are many different ways to connect. Some of us were just talking earlier that a lot of young people would never imagine that if they're interested in agriculture and want to have an impact in the world, that maybe the State Department is a place that they could go work. Who would think that? But yes, that is a place they can find a home.
Very important. And as you mentioned, you're with the State Department. What was your background before this current role? Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I grew up in Western Tennessee, worn a number of different hats. I worked for non-government organizations. I worked for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. I headed up something called the Global Crop Diversity Trust, which is an international organization focused on conserving crop diversity for plant breeding purposes. I was a university professor in Norway, actually. And then I was retired when the government asked me to come take this job.
We thank you for your willingness to come back and lend your expertise.
Well, one says yes to those questions.
Exactly, very much so. Let's talk a little bit about agriculture research and development. How do those kind of investments continue to contribute to the increasing resilience of American farmers and the ag supply chain?
I think particularly in the current context, agricultural R&D is absolutely essential to our own future, our collective future on this planet. If you think about it, the last big quantum leap in agricultural production, if you want to focus it on any particular event, was the Green Revolution in the 1960s. That's Norman Borlaug. We haven't had anything quite like that since. We've had incremental increases, but here's the problem. If you look forward at the demand for food for 2050 and just look at the demographic growth in population, we're not set to meet that demand. We're set to fall pretty far short of it. So you can think of something, economists have a measure of this, they call it total factor productivity. It's a pretty complicated measurement, but in essence, what it does is say, well, how much food are we producing for a given amount of input? And the input can be capital and labor and seeds and fertilizer and everything else. We really need to be improving at a rate of about 2% a year if we're going to meet food demand by 2050. We're currently improving at a rate a little over 1%, and we need to be about 2%. Now, that may not seem like a lot. That's just 1%, but that's 1% every year. So by 2050, we've got 20 or 30% compounded that we fall short by. And now that's significant. And of course, we don't all eat globally. So if you look at the hot spots in terms of hunger in the world, particularly Africa, where do they fall on that range? Are they at 1%? Are they hitting the 2% goal? No, actually, they slipped into the negative column. So we're already looking at a disaster there. And the continent of Africa is going to be the most populated by the end of the century. And one could ask, who cares? Why should we care in the United States? But we have to realize that food security is intimately linked with national security. So you have, in places where you have severe food insecurity, those are the places where you have civil strife and war. And those can have a direct, immediate, profound impact on Americans. What can we do to help them? Well, ag R&D is a place that we can contribute. And I find it fascinating to think that even the funding that the United States government puts into agricultural research that's directed towards a foreign audience, towards helping farmers in other countries, has a net positive benefit back to U.S. agriculture. I mean, agricultural R&D is, frankly, one of those few things that government does that has a net positive impact, a net return on investment. That's particularly the case for our agricultural R&D that's really focused on American farmers. But it's true even for our more philanthropic, if you will, efforts abroad. However, if you look at where we stand with agricultural R&D now, on an inflation-adjusted basis, we're back where we were 50 years ago. Now, do we have fewer challenges today than we had 50 years ago? Can we foresee maybe having even greater challenges in the future? And how are we going to meet those challenges if we don't keep up with our ag R&D expenditures? And by the way, studies out of the University of Minnesota, old friend and colleague of mine, Phil Pardee there, have shown that agricultural R&D has a lifespan of about 50 years. So once you get to the end of a research project, that can be a new technology, it can be a new crop variety, it can be whatever, you typically have a technology that will have an effect for about 50 years. Now, we've been, in a way, stagnating our ag R&D. And I'll just say parenthetically that while we've been doing that, other countries have been going forward, China in particular, that was maybe less than 1% of global total ag R&D in 1980s, is now about a quarter of global expenditures. So we've fallen behind. We're in second place by a long shot to China right now. And one could ask, well, what's the long-term implication of that? I'll leave that to you and your listeners. But these are profitable investments we can make, and I think we need to get serious about that. And because of what I mentioned earlier, we can't depend on these small incremental increases in productivity year after year. We need some moonshots now to pay off. We need to think about how much we gained in the 1960s, 70s, and today because of the quote-unquote green revolution that took place. We need some quantum leaps forward like that. And to do that, we need to be aspirational and be bold and invest in some really interesting, cool things that we hope will pay off.
What role does technology play in that? You think about the Green Revolution and Dr. Borlaug and everything he did with typical conventional breeding, but now technology could really maybe help us make that moonshot. So do you see a role for technology both here in the U.S. and across the world?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we're promoting through the State Department and through USAID and their Feed the Future program, our Agency for International Development, is something we're calling the Vision for Adapted Crops and Soils. And that's focused on trying to help African countries improve the nutrition in those countries and productivity, of course, through using some of their indigenous crops. They've long been ignored, have suffered what the African Union calls massive underinvestment. And frankly, a lot of these crops are crops that I wouldn't have thought 10 years, 20 years ago about promoting plant breeding efforts. And some of them have particular characteristics that are unattractive in the marketplace or for processing or something like that. But with new technologies, it becomes interesting and feasible and possible to overcome some of those barriers. So crops that we had 10 or 20 years ago would have assigned not quite to the dump heap, but would have said these are never going to be major crops, never going to contribute that much to nutrition, now can. And in the current climate and with the current demands trying to, build food security and improve nutrition and reduce childhood stunting and wasting, we can't afford to just look the other way and not have these crops realize their full potential. So we think it's time to take a broad look at agriculture, figure out where are our best bets, where's our money best invested for the biggest payoff. And in a lot of places, that's going to be coming down to what is going to provide the best nutrition year-round. And I would say in foreign countries, it's particularly for women and children.
Yeah, improving those crops to provide the nutrition. You talk about maximizing those investments, and I hear Secretary Vilsack, USDA Secretary Vilsack, talk all the time about the public-private partnership and leveraging federal dollars to attract private investment. How do you see that?
I think that's very critical. We work hand in glove with the private sector. 5 minutes before you came in the room, I was talking with a representative of one of the largest grain companies in the world. So we're very much in sync with those people. We find that there's a great deal of goodwill and humanitarian motivation from some of the private sector, even located here in Iowa. You're the home of some of the largest, best, oldest seed companies in the world, fertilizer companies in other states. So if you think about the kind of challenges we face in agriculture globally and what it's going to require to overcome the obstacles to productivity, it's hard to imagine that that's going to take place simply with government dollars, either ours or theirs. To scale up some of the technologies and innovations we have, we're really going to need to create an enabling environment for the private sector.
You talked about food security is national security, global security. One of my favorite quotes, and I don't know who to attribute to, is if you have a full stomach, you have a lot of problems. If you have an empty stomach, you have one problem, and that's finding food. So elaborate a little more on the national security aspects of having food security.
Well, I think that observation is correct. I wish I knew who said it. But the link between food insecurity and conflict is a very old link. It goes back at least 1,000 years, and there are all kinds of academic articles that will talk about the positive correlation between food problems and civil strife. And we were having an El Nino, which is a warming trend event when Arab Spring started. Yeah, there were many causes of the unrest in the Mideast, but food insecurity and lowered food production was certainly one of them when the fire got lit. That's been the case for a long time. And from a U.S. perspective, I think both in terms of our values as a country, and the humanitarian spirit that I think lives in the heart of all good Americans, but also, frankly, in terms of our own best self-interest, economically, politically, and otherwise. We need a peaceful world. We want a peaceful world. And it behooves us, I think, if we have the means, and I believe we do, to help other countries strengthen their own food security.
Obviously, we've talked about funding is key. What's it going to take to get more dollars? We talked a little bit about leveraging private dollars, but who should we be talking to get this word out, to maybe emphasize the importance of research and development? We have a great university up the road, Iowa State University, that really helps just in the day-to-day farming and improving yields and things like that. But how can we, as a collective agriculture community, encourage more funding for these type of efforts?
Well, dollars are tight in Washington and on Capitol Hill. I guess to some degree it's a political question, but I think your audience, farmers, understand the necessity for taking care of the basics, the fundamentals. Those are things we're pushing internationally, the fundamentals being trying to take care of your soil and make sure you have fertile, healthy soil, and adapted crops, adapted to what? To market conditions, to the environment, to the weather, to the climate that you have. Those are basic things, and it's in our interest to promote that. And those things can't be achieved without agricultural R&D. So I think what we need is for common people in the heartland and elsewhere to voice that concern. My experience is, and I, before I moved to Washington to take this job, was living on a farm in upstate New York, and still have a family farm in my family, fifth generation in western Tennessee. Farmers understand the plight of other farmers. I don't care where you are, a farmer in one place is going to hold out his or her hand to a farmer in another place and help them. They can empathize with that. Agricultural R&D is a place where you link all farmers together, because it really is the kind of public sector effort where all boats rise, in a sense. And I think that's one of the messages that we have to get across to increasingly in Congresses and parliaments and such globally, is that all of our economies are really based on food, aren't they, in agriculture. Back in the 30s, when you had the Dust Bowl era here, Roosevelt said that a country that destroys its soil destroys itself. And it was just another way of saying that you have to take care of the basics and the fundamentals. That's what we're trying to do. These days, that requires, I think, more and more ag R&D.
Dr. Fowler, are there any other efforts that you can talk about with the State Department in relation to food and food security?
Sure, a couple. Obviously, one of the big events in the last year or so has been the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the attempt to destroy that government, and the successful attempt to reduce a lot of their agricultural exports. So we've been very active in that. Some of the major corporations in the United States very active, certainly the grain trade, but also equipment manufacturers and seed trade are very active. Ukraine has been a market for them. At the State Department, we're also interested in having good markets for American products. And one thing that happens when you're in the middle of a food crisis is that countries start to look out for themselves, and they start to do things that are really quite counterproductive from a global perspective. So they start to put on export bans and restrictions and duties and things like that, which creates havoc in the marketplace. It undermines markets for American products. And so one thing we jump on early and hard at the State Department is talking to governments to say, wait a minute, be careful about what you're doing. Not only is it going to make the situation worse, not only is it going to increase price volatility, but in the long run, it's going to hurt you. And in the long run, it's not going to have the domestic benefits that you think it might. Sometimes, governments are playing to the home folks, and they think that, well, if there's a food crisis, we'll just stop exporting this particular crop and prices will go down domestically and everybody will be happy. That's not really the way it works out in the end. So we try to keep the markets open and flowing, and that's one of the big tasks of the State Department.
Yeah, we've seen that since the Ukraine war, people pulling back, getting protective, and it ended up backfiring. Every action has a reaction that maybe is not thought about. So these last few years have really been eye-opening.
Yeah, they sure have been. And I think that one of the lessons of the Russia-Ukraine war has been, frankly, how interdependent we are and how much we're living in a global food system and how precarious that is, that you can have an event in one country that has a ripple effects all across the world. So we have to be careful about those things. They need management.
Thanks, Dr. Fowler. You know, I'm sure that many people who work outside of agriculture would hear a conversation like this and have a difficult time tying it back to their own lives. Farmers are definitely the exception to that. Everyone listening to this podcast episode knows that global trends, disturbances, and policy decisions factor greatly into the outlook for Iowa agriculture and our farms. But at the same time, we continue to see a growing interest from the consumers in our own backyards, with the demand for locally grown and raised ag products reaching new heights. It's that local consumer that's actually the focus of our next opportunity for you. In recent months, we've been hearing from farmers like you who have an interest in elevating their direct-to-consumer brands and marketing efforts. With that in mind, we're offering our first ever marketing and branding workshop series for Iowa farmers and small ag businesses. This series will give you the opportunity to learn from a leading Des Moines-based branding and marketing agency in early December and mid-January. Space is limited, so if you have an interest in learning more about these marketing and branding workshops, please check out the link in the notes for this episode. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for the next episode on November 20th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to The Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.